Welcome to another episode of Before You Kill Yourself with your host, Leo Flowers. I am Leo Flowers. Today's guest is Heather Hutchinson. She's a singer, songwriter, and author out of Vancouver who wrote one of the Amazon's top selling memoirs called Holding On by Letting Go. Heather, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Now, so tell us more about this memoir that you've written. I know it revolves around you being born blind and in Latin America.
Yeah, so I actually grew up in Canada and then moved to Latin America. So it kind of talks about the cultural differences between my life as a blind person here in Canada and in Latin America, and then kind of the parallel theme, I guess, of how somebody can get to the point where they feel like they have no other option um, than to take their own life, and then how someone gets back from that point.
So let's backtrack a little bit, obviously, and that point where you wanted to end your life. Tell us more about your childhood and growing up. Both parents at home, single parent, siblings.
My childhood was actually really normal up to a certain age. My dad was diagnosed with cancer when I was 3, and he was in and out of remission a lot throughout my childhood. And he left when I was 6, and then came back, and then left again when I was 13. So it was kind of, a little bit in flux.
So, was there sometimes when the parent leaves the house or there's a divorce in the family or separation, sometimes the child internalizes that and thinks that they are responsible for that. Were those some of the feelings that came up for you?
I think so, especially in the way that, you know, having a child with a disability puts strain on families that they wouldn't normally have. So I guess, yeah, in a way, I was aware of that strain and conscious of it, and it did kind of make me feel like, maybe if that hadn't happened, things would have worked out differently for them.
Right, because I'm sure you overheard arguments,
For sure, yeah.
right? And what were some of the things that were brought up around you and being blind?
There was a lot of advocacy that had to be done throughout my education. Um, it's actually so I was mainstreamed, but to get the technology and the resources that I needed for school was very challenging. I often didn't have textbooks, and I never had a calculator, things like that. So my family was really involved in advocacy, which I know put strain on my parents' relationship because they sort of felt like they were so tied up in this advocacy that they weren't really having a relationship for themselves.
Right. The advocacy created a distance and strain
Yes.
on their intimacy.
Mhm.
And so, is it genetic? Are there the other members of your family who experience this also?
No, it is genetic, but nobody in my family is a dominant carrier of it.
So, what is the gene, or what do you know about the causes of the blindness?
It's an eye disease called Leber congenital amaurosis, and basically it affects the rods and cones of the eye.
And is it something? Is it painful? Is there an experience? Is it 100% or there's blurred vision? To what
No,
extent?
so it's a lot of people think blindness is all or nothing. It's more of a continuum. So the doctors classify my vision as light perception only, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. In low light, I actually see a lot better. I can see stark contrasts. In really bright light, I'm pretty much effectively completely blind, but I am a braille reader and I do use a cane. So there's not really a whole lot of functional vision.
So yeah, so how were you learning if you because you mentioned earlier that it was hard to get the resources you needed for education. What was education like for you early on? Were you able to early on start to learn braille reading, or did he just have you sitting in class and hoping that you'd absorb it?
I did have actually in my early education some really amazing supports. It was more the people that really stepped up rather than, actual government resources. And I actually learned Braille from an EA, educational assistant, who was taking the Braille course at the same time as me. So she would be like one lesson ahead of me. And so she just kind of hoped that I would overtake her. So yeah, that's how I learned Braille. I didn't actually learn Braille from a teacher, but I was really motivated. I always really enjoyed reading, so that really helped, to have that motivation um, to really put in the effort to learn to read, despite lack of access to information and Braille books and things like that.
Yeah, because you're also feeling like your life is dependent on it. Like your life is like on the line here in terms of learning how to read and learning how to navigate the world in some type of literary sense.
Yeah, for sure. And unfortunately, the literacy rate among blind people is quite low. I don't know the exact statistic, but it's not the best, which is, troubling because it affects everything, right? Like you're going on to university, employment opportunities. So it really is so important that we are teaching blind children how to read at an early age.
And one of the things that I remember growing up, and there'd be moments where they would have us practice walking around with a blindfold on to know what it's like to be blind, and I could tell from the giggle, like I realized it's insulting because there is a difference between like just being blinded
Yes.
out of nowhere and being born blind. Can you speak to that, and how do you feel about those experiments that sometimes are done in school? Or
Yeah, you totally nailed it. There's a lot of that sort of thing. I think in Vancouver, actually, even there's a restaurant where people go and it's completely dark and they try to eat this meal in the dark. And I think unfortunately, it creates more anxiety around being blind and blind people than it actually serves to educate because you are suddenly thrust into this darkness. You don't have the skills that somebody who was born blind will have learned after years and years and years of trial and error. So, of course, it's going to be scary for somebody who just all of a sudden is blind. And it's just a really poor representation of what our lives are actually like.
yeah, and in an educational system, I remember we had a kid in my high school who had polio, and I don't know what his 24/7 experience was like, but he seemed well adapted. No, none of us, like, we had a group of friends, and none of us ever mentioned him walking with the cane or anything like that. Did you feel like you had friends, or was there any bullying, or what was your experience like, with other students and other kids of your age growing up?
I was lucky. I had a really good group of friends. I think when you're really young, kids don't even notice, right? Like they're pretty self absorbed. And the world hasn't really taught them yet to fear differences. So my friends were really good. I had kind of a core group of friends throughout elementary school, junior high, high school. There was bullying for sure. I remember the first time I actually really realized that I was different, or that I would be seen as different kind of by the world, I was 5, and I had been playing on the playground with this kid who was a couple years older than me. We'd been playing all afternoon, and he asked me, "Why do you never look at anything?" And I told him I'm blind, like super matter of fact, because nobody really thought anything of it at that point. And his reaction was just so swift. We were standing at the top of the slide and he pushed me backwards. So I fell and he went down, I yelled some insults over his shoulder about me being blind, and then got on his bike and rode away. And it was kind of like the first, like, my God, I remember laying there going, I'm different, and different is clearly bad, and this is forever. But so yeah, there was definitely bullying that went on, from that part on in school, but I did have a really good core group of friends.
And I would assume that, you guys did all the same things and, you ran around, you played. Was there anything that stood out to you from that friendship that you were like, "Yeah, I'm pretty much like all the other kids?"
Yeah, for sure. I think I was a little bit sensitive to it as we got older, in that sometimes I felt like I might be slowing down my friends, and none of my close friends ever mentioned it to me, but I was concerned, and it did create some anxiety for me around, would they rather me not be there? Am I slowing them down too much? Like, we'd go to an amusement park or something, and they'd all be like running around taking the stairs, and I'd be like a little bit slower behind them, and inevitably one of my close friends would stay behind with me and kind of ignore their urge to run ahead and ride all the rides that they could. And so that was a little bit concerning for me, that, maybe they would prefer not to.
Yeah, so it sounds like you felt like a burden kind of to your friends, but and also to your family.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's fair.
What was your outlet for managing those emotions? Were there school resources like a therapist or counselor that you could talk to?
Yeah, when I was in junior high, I had regular meetings with the school's guidance counselor, and then I was referred to a social worker for some of the challenges that I was having at home, and I did have a psychologist as well at that point. So, yeah, there was definitely resources.
And what kind of skills or how did they help you navigate, through that mentally? Were there any reframes? Were there any skills, any practices, journaling? What kind of tools did they give you?
Yeah, journaling was a big one. Just sort of, resilience, like really trying to reframe, how I was feeling about things. CBT, of course, was a big one.
Can you give us some examples, like how you were thinking about things and how they helped you reframe it?
Mm, let's see. Something like, oh, I'm going to go into the school cafeteria or some public place, and everyone's going to be staring at me and judging me, and I'm going to do something stupid, and everyone's going to laugh. You reshape that to, okay, is that completely rational, or is that me projecting, when maybe a more realistic approach is that people are generally good and they want to see the good in others?
Oh, I love that. So the cognitive behavioral therapy, resilience,
Mhm.
journaling. Did they have you journal anything specific? Were there any specific journaling techniques they asked you to incorporate?
Not really, no. I started journaling really ever since I could write. Like, I remember being, like, 6 years old and starting a journal, and it was, like, daily for the vast majority of my life. So it wasn't really, like, this big homework assignment that they had me do, because I was already doing it.
So what is when in terms of journaling, what did that look like for you? Were you typing it? Was it talk to text?
Initially, it was Braille on, like, this really old school, um, they call it a Perkins Brailler. It kinda looks like a super old school typewriter, but, like, with 6 keys. And then in junior high, I moved to a laptop. And yeah, so from then it was more text journaling, just typed on a computer.
So at what point are the thoughts of wanting to end your life seeping in?
Well, when I was 12, I lost someone to suicide. And I remember a lot of the adults around, it was kind of kept quiet how she died. And there was this undercurrent of like, "Oh my god, how could she do that?" That how horrible, think of her poor family. And I looked at it at 12 years old and I started thinking to myself, maybe that's not such a bad idea. Maybe what she did actually made a whole lot of sense because who wouldn't plan their own exit if life got to be too much? And I kind of admired her decision. And I guess I really, from there, started thinking and considering it more and more.
So we're having these thoughts. You're admiring her decision of like, wow, the pain is too much. You made a decision on how you wanted to end this, and nobody else is talking about this, right? This is what we do around suicide is no one
Mhm.
talks about
Yes.
it. And so you're just left to your own thoughts and your own ideas and fascinations. Um
Yeah.
and so what happens after that? What are your next steps?
Well, so that was 12. At 13, my dad left again. At 14, I decided that I was going to have no more contact with him. He had partial custody of my brother and I, but I actually moved out of his house and refused to see him, which also meant that I lost contact with most of my extended family, who I'd seen kind of every week since I was born. And the bullying at school had gotten pretty bad by that point because that was, junior high or middle school, whatever you call it there, middle school, I think. Um, and it just kind of, I was feeling really alone and I had really struggled with anxiety since I was really young. And I just got really sick of feeling sick all the time and scared all the time. And so that led to depression, and the depression led to, well, why don't I end my life?
And so let me get this right. You lost your friend at 12.
Yes.
Your dad leaves when you're 13. And then you moved out the house when you were 13?
Out of his house, yes.
Out of his house. And so where did you live?
So I was staying with my mom full time.
And so I'm assuming that if you were living with your dad, you didn't want to live with your mom either initially.
Well, they had split custody initially, so I was spending, whatever it was, a week there, weekends in different places.
And when you said that the bullying in junior high got worse, how was it different than the early experience that you reported?
I think early on in elementary school, the games were a little bit more innocent. Like people would come up and be like, "Oh, guess who I am?" Or "How many fingers am I holding up?" Just kind of like annoying things, but not really super hurtful. And then by junior high, they would, the bullying got a lot more physical. They would, kick me, they would steal my cane, to see how I could manage without it. They would tell me I should kill myself because I was useless, so things like that. So, you're being told these things and more, you start thinking, well, maybe they have a point.
So there's, how do you say this? There's discontent in the home.
Mhm.
School doesn't feel like a safe place anymore. And if people are telling you that you're useless and there's physical bullying, where do you navigate from there?
In what way?
In terms of uh you're going from you went from your dad's to your mom's house. I guess psychologically, emotionally, like, because obviously, like, you're having these thoughts, like you said, of wanting to end your life, and you're just sick and tired of being sick and tired. What are the steps that you take after that? Because you mentioned earlier about therapy and things like that. What did you anchor on to? What kept you going?
I think therapy, the social worker I was seeing was really great, and music was a huge one. I started getting seriously into music around that time. That was kind of really my outlet. I started writing songs, and then I actually met my producer when I was 15, and we actually started recording my first album when I was 15. So that was really like it gave me something, it gave me a purpose, it gave me something to focus on despite bad I was feeling all the time.
I love that. In Thomas Joyner's book, I think it's called Why People Kill Themselves or End Their Lives. He whittles it down to two things: purpose and people. Like we
Yes.
need to feel connected to a purpose, and we need to feel connected to people, or at least an idea of
Mhm.
of people. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so when I started recording music, I was actually getting that connection to people because I was meeting all these really incredible it was so crazy because it was like, one day I was playing music with my friends in the band room in high school, and the next day I'm in a professional recording studio working with professional musicians. And it was like the group that I was surrounded by were just so encouraging. So, they treated me as an equal, like I mattered. And that was something I really, really needed at that point.
Are you dating at any point along this journey?
Yeah, yeah, I had boyfriends for sure.
And were they also blind, or they were both?
No, I've actually never dated a blind person.
Wow. Um, so you got the music career is starting to take off. You record your first album. Did you record it at the age of 15?
Yeah, so it came out when I was 16.
Wow. Okay. So we have an album out when we're 16. We're finding purpose, we're finding people. Is your relationship, how old are you now?
Now,
Yeah,
33.
33. So how has your relationship with your parents evolved over time?
It's interesting. I would say that COVID, of all things, kind of really helped us find that connection again, and in a way, my book as well. So I would say my relationship with my parents right now is better than it has been really since I was a kid.
And what do you think you said because of COVID, in what way did COVID help? Is it because you're spending more time together, or what do you think was happening there?
No, so my parents both live far away, but there was this whole, kind of shift to online, and people were reaching out, I think, in ways that they wouldn't normally because everyone's feeling the isolation. So, my dad would start calling me to check in, and we didn't really talk a lot before that, but all of a sudden he's calling me like fairly regularly, and you actually start having conversations because when you're talking to somebody often enough, you start actually talking to them, beyond just the weather and stuff. So we were actually able to forge a connection and sort of get back some of that relationship that we lost when I was really pretty young.
Are there things that you've learned about your father that help you have a bit more compassion for what you're experiencing growing up?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question because yes, absolutely. I think going through my own mental health struggles and the perspective of being somebody older now, I'm not a kid, you don't just see things from your own perspective. It makes it easier, I suppose, to understand why the things happen the way they did, and have compassion for somebody who is obviously really having their own struggles.
Yeah, because cancer is such I don't even know what kind of cancer he had, but I imagine it was costly, it's time consuming, and just quite emotionally draining. Is he, is his I would assume his cancer is in remission. Has it been cured, or what kind of cancer was it?
I believe it's in remission now, but it was a struggle for a lot of years. He was diagnosed when I was 3, and then it was just kind of on and off and on and off. Actually, right after I left his house, he was came out of remission, which was like a huge guilt thing for me, as because you're a teenager, you're pretty self-absorbed, and it's like, oh my God, like, did I cause this?
Yeah, it's interesting how much we think we have an impact on people, and then at
Mhm.
the same time feel like we have no impact at all, right?
Yes, yeah,
Like we're causing all the harm in the world, but we don't bring any joy to the world.
yeah, yeah, exactly, that's very true.
Were there things about your mom and uh, how she, in turn, let me rephrase the question. Were there things about your mom that came up that had shed some light on what you're experiencing growing up also?
Yeah, I think for both of my parents, I think at the time, it's very easy, and I think we're conditioned as kids to see, bad guys and good guys, like, we learn that so young, right? So, I think I maybe vilified my dad without really seeing the bigger picture and, kind of understanding as I got older that there is no black and white. Most people aren't all good or all evil. We're all just kind of wounded people trying to deal with our demons in the best way we know how.
It's so much fun though to vilify people. It's
It is. It's very satisfying.
I mean, it's in all the movies. Like, you're
Yeah,
either with me
exactly.
or you're against me, and we just tend to think that that's a healthy way of viewing the world, and we learn hopefully throughout our journey that it does us more harm than good.
Yeah, exactly. We're holding on to it. They don't know we're holding on to it. We're just repeatedly hurting ourselves. So, forgiveness isn't really about them. It's about freeing ourselves.
Can you speak more to that? Because I know so many people who are listening right now are having such a hard time forgiving people in their lives or even forgiving themselves. Are there ways in which you've had to forgive yourself?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Um, I guess especially actually fairly recently, just with my mental health struggles, knowing what I put my loved ones through was very challenging for me to accept. And, you already feel so badly about yourself. And then you have this added guilt of, well, I'm doing this to everybody else. Look what they're going through because of me. And that's not helpful for anybody either. So it was actually kind of in the hospital when one of the psychiatrists mentioned, a lot of what you're going through does have a genetic component, and it was kind of at that point that I was able to let go a little bit of that guilt and stop seeing it as all my fault and that I was doing this all to everybody else, and I guess have a little bit more compassion for myself at the same time.
It's easy to think that because you're blind, that that's your biggest problem, your biggest
Yeah.
issue. What would you say is your biggest challenge right now?
My biggest challenge, I think you're so right. Everyone focuses on the blindness because it's the thing that they can see, right? They don't see, the other environmental risk factors of growing up, exposed to mental illness, which was obviously very difficult. Um, the bullying, experiencing sexual violence, all these kind of factors that play into everything, but nobody sees that part and they just focus on, well, I mean, you're blind, of course you're depressed.
Do you have a daily practice? Because I would imagine going through those different experiences of trauma, uh, images, sensations, things come back up for you at
Yes.
random times. Two questions. One is, do you have a daily practice that kind of grounds you and centers you? And then the second question is, do you have strategies for those moments where the the trauma does flare up?
Yeah, so question 1, daily practice. I I'm not perfect at this, but I try to meditate every day, for, 5 minutes or whatever on Insight Timer or Calm, there's quite a few apps. And then mindfulness practice, I like the one, I don't know if you've heard of it, where you're sitting on, like, a riverbank and you're the only one there, and you have your hand kind of in the water and the leaves are going by. I don't know if you've heard of this one?
Oh, yeah, I pee myself every time I listen to that one. It's not the best one, Leo
And,
Flowers.
you either grab the leaf as it goes by because the leaves are your thoughts, or you let it go. So yeah, those are kinda like the mindfulness meditation things. And then question 2, I think the most important thing is to take hold of those thoughts before I'm completely mired in them, because, it gets to a point where you've gone so far down the spiral that you can't pull yourself back up at that point. So if you can recognize, "Oh, I'm going back to this place of trauma, I'm reliving these memories." If you can get on top of it really quick, then, distraction, meditation, go for a walk, in my case, play some music, journaling, all that kind of thing. But I think the key is you catch it as soon as you possibly can, and that takes practice.
It does take practice. It's so interesting because when at least for me, when I go down these wormholes, and I'm ruminating or overly obsessing over a thing, um, I just kind of go with it and let myself, go deeper and deeper, and it becomes harder and harder to pull yourself out.
Mhm.
And part of it is like, well, if I'm thinking this, then I must want to think it. When, like you said, it's a muscle of recognizing when you're going down that rabbit hole and then pulling yourself out. And then it becomes easier to pull yourself out, and then you're going down fewer and fewer rabbit holes over time,
Mm.
ideally.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Were there any meds prescribed to you at any point?
Yeah, I've been on and off antidepressants since, I guess, my 2nd year, I think, of university. Um, but I was actually studying in a different province, and my doctor was in my home province, so I never really had any kind of follow-up to see how it was working. So I actually quit cold turkey, which I know is terrible because I wanted to go out and party with my friends. Um, not the best. So then I came back to it a few years later, a much more systematic approach with a doctor who did do a lot of, well, still does do a lot of follow up. And, it's a constant kind of revision, I guess, of especially when you're using multiple meds at once. I think it's a lot of trial and error, and what works for me right now might not work for me in a couple months. So I think it's really important to have, when we are on those kind of psychiatric meds, that follow up is so critical.
So critical, absolutely. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you love to share from your journey and your experiences?
Hmm. I guess that's a hard one. If you're feeling like, you don't want to do this anymore, I think it's so important to remember that there have been others who have come before you who feel that way. We may not talk about, because we kind of focus on recovery, right? So we may not talk about those dark places. And I think that can make people feel really alone, but you're not alone in those places, in those times. And I think that, I'm not gonna say a bunch of empty platitudes like, "Oh, tomorrow's a better day, cheer up, it'll get better." Because when I was going through it, that was, about the time I would completely stop listening. But I can promise you that there will come a day when you will stop in a moment and you'll feel such profound joy. and you'll stop and you'll think to yourself, I would have missed this, and I hope with all my heart that you will hang on for that day.
Last two questions. Actually, I have three questions left. One is, we watched this movie called Sound of Metal,
Mhm.
and it's about a drummer who loses his hearing, and then he has the opportunity to undergo a surgery, which would allow him to hear. Would you do the same thing for vision, or are you at a place now where it's not a thing that you're looking to correct?
That's a good question, and there are some upcoming treatments that may be available in the next few years. They're very expensive, which is, obviously one factor. I think I would, but not for the reasons that people think. Like, everybody thinks, "Oh, how great would it be if you could see the sunset or your loved ones' faces?" For me, it's more of like a practical thing. Like, cool, I could drive a car. Um, it would be easier. I wouldn't have to field stupid questions from people who sit down on the bus next to me and, want to ask my entire medical history, things like that. So, and, just that lack of like discrimination that would come from having my sight that would make my life easier.
The independence is what you'd
Yeah.
be opting in for, it sounds like.
Yeah.
And I know that you're an avid reader. Is there a book that you have reread or would recommend just because you love it? Just, no, like not because it's a mental health book, but just a book you really savored and enjoyed.
Hmm. Like mental health specifically,
No, it
or
could be any book. So, I read somewhere that all books are self-help books. So, and I
yeah,
really
yeah,
believe
that's
that.
true.
I get something out of any book that I read.
I wouldn't say like there's one specific book that I absolutely would recommend everyone reads. I think more broadly for me, I really find memoirs a lot more helpful than actual self-help books. Because you're actually seeing these people's stories and how they evolved and things. To me, it's a lot more real than just some doctor telling you that these are the things that you should do.
Completely agreed. And, it's so funny because I have not read a lot of memoirs. I find bios to be more helpful than self-help books, but
Hmm.
I never realized like how much more helpful a memoir is also. I mean, you're basically it feels like you're reading someone's journal.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Like, I one comes to mind being a kid in Angela's Ashes, and that one like stuck in my head. I think of it still now, and just it really shows the pain and the journey that people go on instead of this clinical like well, this is the step you take now, and this is the step that you take now. No, it's more like, this is my journey, and I'm putting it out there, and I hope that it'll help people.
Are you a part of any groups? Just in
Groups.
general, just general like whether it's for work or a band or uh like self-help or any type of groups or organizations?
Not really. I'm actually on a waiting list to get into group therapy, which I don't I'm not really sure how I feel about that one. In terms of music, COVID kind of killed that, unfortunately. I'm definitely looking at getting back into groups and bands and things like that, which would be great because, as we talked about earlier, we need that connection and that purpose.
Absolutely. Heather, last question, because I always imagine that there's one person listening in who may be on the precipice of wanting to end their life. And you did kind of answer this earlier, but in case you had future thoughts, what would you say to them?
I would say that you might not feel like there's anyone out there who cares, but I can tell you with 100% certainty that that is absolutely not true. And that, having been on both sides of it, losing somebody to suicide and being suicidal myself, I can tell you when they say, that common refrain about when somebody dies by suicide, their pain isn't lost, it's just transferred onto the other people left behind. I can tell you that's absolutely 100% true. And there are people who care and that would miss you. And I just really hope that you will hold on, because tomorrow might not be a better day, but one day you're going to have your first day where you take your first steps into recovery.
I love that. One day will be your first day. Thank you so much, Heather Hutchinson. Thank you so much, listeners, for tuning in. Remember, this podcast is not a substitute for you going to get help, for you calling the 1-800 SUICIDE or 1-800-273-TALK or any of the other phone numbers listed in the show notes. Whether you're in Sri Lanka or Latin America or Canada, there are international suicide hotline numbers available for you. You can always go to thrivewithleo.com for one-on-one coaching with yours truly. Let's get to tomorrow together. Thank you so much, Heather.
Thank you.